So you've joined me for the Firm and Liability, Topic 7 in Enterprise and Governance and SILS at Waseda University. So let's turn to the issues, and I'll advance us first of all through the slides, and I'll toggle back and forth between the not so good images of myself and probably the slightly more desirable pictures of the slides, but in the end just talking slides are incredibly tedious. So we've got a quote here right from the beginning from the authors of our text, Micklethwaite and Wooldridge, and this is something you will have already read yourselves, but let's look at it again. The Companies Act, which were rapidly copied in other countries, unleashed entrepreneurs to raise money, safe in the knowledge that investors could lose only what they had put in. They also gave birth to an organization that soon seemed to acquire a life of its own, swiftly mutating from one shape to another. So it's this element here that investors could only lose what they put in, this notion of limited liability here, that is what we particularly want to focus on, and some of the implications of that. We have already, that's really weird. Okay, I've upgraded my software here, and so that's really, really weird. It's like I'm peering through a post box. Okay, and this is I'm peering through a slit in a wall. Okay, let's go to there. That's not particularly desirable because you won't be able to read those slides. Looking at the screen here, although you do have the PowerPoints yourselves, you can toggle back and forth hopefully through your own device, but I will also, as I go through the slides, I'll switch them to the points, to the slides so you can see the points clearly, and then come back to this talking head of me. Okay. As we talk about in class, because I'm always going on about this, and is very clear in the textbook, but is often not understood by a lot of people who simply associate Adam Smith with a defense of capitalism as we know it in this day and age. Adam Smith was far more nuanced than that. He defended the dynamism of markets, and at the same time he was very wary about the modern limited liability corporation, and we have to take that very, very seriously. And that's like many aspects of misunderstanding about where we stand in relation to markets versus established businesses that we know today. And I'll come back to a number of these points here. But particularly Adam Smith was, in a sense, a classical economist, like neoclassical economists and neoliberals more recently, have been very much worried that any kind of government intervention that effectively distorted responsibility for one's actions, literally for taking responsibility or bearing the liability of your decisions, your choices in life, any kind of government intervention, particularly in relation to something so potentially powerful as a large corporate entity, raised the risk that firms would privatize the profits and socialize the losses. That is, that they would structure the business around limited liability, that when things were going well, of course, there would be lots of profits. Those profits would be captured by the shareholders, and they'd be very happy with that. If, on the other hand, if the business failed, the people who had established the business, who had raised capital from other people with promises of the great potential returns, and then had let the business, or through just poor judgment, the business had failed, then they would walk away not bearing any costs other than what they might have put into themselves, maybe some of their own capital, certainly their own time, but they would walk away and they would leave lots of other people out of pocket. They would leave customers perhaps having paid up for goods which were never delivered to them. This has happened to me in the past. Somewhere around here in my office, I still have plane tickets that date back to an airline failure back in 2001. Just like I had one in 2020 as well too. Airlines that fail and you don't get to fly, unfortunately. I remember many years ago, my first boss, when I had my first academic teaching position, he was an American, he said, "You're not a real adult until you've actually lost plane tickets in an airline bankruptcy." I thought at the time it was a little bit weird, and in a matter of months, that's exactly what happened to me. And it's happened to me twice now. So when businesses fail, very often people don't get what they've paid for, or they don't get paid for what they've done for the company, for example. Certainly investors, they lose the money that they've put in, but at least they do that very, very conscious that they are, to some degree, gambling on the prospects of the firm. This expression, to privatize profits and socialize losses, and let me go to the slides to emphasize this here, you're going to hear this from me a number of times. When we talk about regulation, when we talk about the state stepping in to take responsibility in lieu of companies when they fail, for example, often this has the attributes of socializing the losses, of making society at large or a subset of society bear the costs for losses arising from a business activity. So one of the other concerns that to some degree Adam Smith touched on, but much later with the rise of the large-scale company, is the notion that somehow the manager-led large enterprise would be very different from the spirit of entrepreneurialism that was associated with the founder-run firm. That managers running a company might not have the same sense of responsibility that someone who's actually worked incredibly hard in the early days of setting up the business did. And they may not have any skin in a game, in a sense, to use the English expression, which also became a very influential notion with one rather critical economics writer who said this, that never deal with anyone who isn't investing their own money or doesn't have something, have a stake in it directly, skin in the game, that doesn't have something to lose. So there's this concern that the manager who can leave and go to work for another company may be profligate with the share's assets, show insufficient regard on the one hand for the shareholders who actually have invested their capital in the company, and at the same time maybe show insufficient regard for the social consequences of the actions of the firm, and particularly if it was to fail. We'll come back to that. That raises some really fundamental issues about incentive design, about how managers can be encouraged to act in the interests of shareholders, and at the same time, of course, managers being held responsible for their conduct leading an organization when that firm does something that's socially responsible. Anyway, let's keep focused on this very specific question of limited versus unlimited liability. Our textbook, the company, talks a great deal about this. What it effectively means when you've got an unlimited liability is that an investor in an enterprise would be accountable for the debts, including all of those arising through legal liabilities of the enterprise. So if myself and say 3 of my friends, we get together and we establish a company, we are the owners of the company, and then business conducted through that company vehicle does something that's wildly socially irresponsible. For example, it has a mine, uses some chemicals to help extract the minerals, and in an act of general mining carelessness, the chemicals get into the river, they kill all the fish, maybe they kill some people downstream, they cause a bit of an environmental catastrophe, involves a huge cleanup, for example. So are the owners of the business that are running that mine held responsible? Well, they may be in terms of directors' responsibilities, but it's been a very common problem in the past with mines, for example, that effectively the business would be closed down, that the capital was put in by the original shareholders, that would all be lost. The firm would be declared bankrupt. There was no money left to pay for the environmental cleanup. So the company's disappeared. The owners of it, the investors, the shareholders, they were only liable up to the amount that they had paid into it. So if it's on a limited liability basis. On an unlimited liability basis, on the other hand, there's a certain social benefit to this. What it means is that The state or the locals who've been affected by this dodgy business can go after the owners of the company to bear the full costs of the cleanup. Okay, so we can immediately see that unlimited liability would create more powerful incentives for the owners of the business to make sure that the business acts in a socially responsible kind of way, because it obviously can be held liable, literally held liable for the full consequences of what it has done. And yet societies pretty much everywhere have moved towards accepting limited liability rather than unlimited liability as the basis for organizing businesses. And the reasons, well, the textbook talks about it. We'll touch a little bit on them further here, and we have in class discussions as well too. Primarily, it was just a much more attractive way much more attractive to investors, therefore a much more promising way to actually raise capital that people could pay in, knowing that they could lose at most the money they have paid up to buy the shares in the company. Okay, so limited liability first arose in the Articles of Association of some English firms in the 17th century, but as I say in the notes here, it had a very dubious status in English law. It was when it went to the United States with the rapid developments in the American colonies, like the independent United States. What we see there quite strikingly is certain states embraced the legal foundations of limited liability because it would attract more investment. And often there was a rivalry for attracting British investment particularly out of London, to various American states. And so each state would write their own corporations law, and so where the law was more favorable to the creation of a company, then the capital was more likely to flow to there. We see that Massachusetts, for example, had a very big debate on this, but in 1830 they adopt limited liability for corporations. So really from the late 1820s, we see a lot of legal innovation in the United States. Effectively then the concept is imported back into Britain. Now the first thing we need to know is that there's actually two different forms of unlimited liability. And let's have a direct look at the slides there so you can see that. One of them is this notion of being joint and severably liable. Okay, this was how it was expressed legally: joint and severably liable. Now, jointly and severally liable, it meant that the owners of the business, each of the shareholders, were jointly liable for any of the debts arising from the company, okay, in the case of its failure. But they're also severally liable, which meant that if the creditors to a company that had failed went looking for someone to take responsibility to pay back the money that was owed to them by the company, they wanted to get their hands on at least one shareholder, and hopefully a shareholder actually had some money to be able to pay them, okay? Which meant that even if you only had one share in the company, you personally could be held responsible for the total debts outstanding to the creditors from a failed enterprise, which is a rather scary prospect, okay? So you think, how is that fair? That you might have, say, let's say you have only one share in 1,000 shares. So you're only 1,000th the owner, but you're personally held 100% liable if they can't catch anyone else. Well, the idea was that you would be held responsible, and then later you would have to pay up, and then later on you would have to go and settle accounts with the others. You could then go and yourself sue the other owners of the business for them to pay their fair share back to you. But the creditors were just worried about getting their money back. They weren't interested in this idea, well, okay, you only owed one share out of 1,000, therefore you only have to pay maybe, $1 of the $1,000 that I am owed. No, I want the full money from you, and then you can sort it out between you and your scoundrel mates who set up this company that employed me, which never was able to pay me and went bankrupt, for example. So the implication here, and let's go back again to the slides, is that it threatened financial ruin to even small passive investors, unlimited liability under the terms of being jointly and severally liable. Okay, so effectively, if you were to engage in what is now a typical investment strategy, individuals do this all the time, large investors do this, diversification where you have small parcels of shares in many companies, this would be perilous. It would mean that if you had, say, even just a few shares in 10 different companies, you could be legally responsible for all the debt of those 10 enterprises, assuming that the creditors couldn't get hold of anyone else. Now, there was another version of unlimited liability which was more reasonable. And this is the commonsensical one. This is proportional unlimited liability. This is where you could only be personally held liable proportionate to your stake in the company. 1% of the shares, so 1% of the liability, the example. Now, actually, very strikingly, this was the law in California until 1931. It was the last to change to limited liability in the USA. Okay, and that may surprise a lot of people, but it does help to explain why many businesses that, although they operated in California, were incorporated in other places. Now, if anyone's seen the film Howard, the Aviator, about Howard Hughes, who was an aviator, he loved to fly, but created Hughes aircraft and did a whole bunch of things. Actually was a Hollywood producer and whatnot too. Created the film Hell's Angels, not about bikies, but about actually World War I fighter pilots. There is a scene in the film there where he is advised by his business managers, no, for tax reasons, we don't want to base this in California. And that was actually quite understandable to audiences. People immediately understand tax, but actually the real reason for the way he structured his business that way was more because of the proportional liability issues rather than anything else. Okay, so this actually did have a very significant impact on entrepreneurs who are, well known historically, and it really patterned where firms were based. Let's think more generally about what limited liability means when we think about companies, and particularly their relationship to society. Well, fundamentally, limited liability reallocates risk from shareholders to creditors. Okay, let's go again into the slides and see this up closely. Okay, often this means that indirectly it's to society at large. And this is most common in the case of workers' entitlements or cleanups, when there's been some kind of industrial disaster, or if a construction company goes bankrupt and leaves a building half built, for example, and there's no money to literally remove it. And you can see these in a whole range of places. You can see this in Japan, actually, in a lot of places. Then if you want to get rid of a half-built building, the local government might have to pay for that to actually remove it. So this is potentially a significant qualification to what we call the shareholder sovereignty model of corporate governance, something we'll talk further about. But this notion that companies are the property of the shareholders are sovereign, and that governments should not mess with it. Well, if it actually turns out that when companies fail, they have shifted liability to creditors and very often to society at large, that is a very significant qualification to the notion that government should stay out of the way and let these sovereign shareholder-owned enterprises do their own thing. Okay, so we can see that also creditors are significant other stakeholders in the firm. Employees are, for example, and we will talk about that when we look at different capitalist systems and the different rights that creditors have in relation to a company. Okay, one of the concerns that has been raised in the past has been the misuse of the limited liability firm. That is where all the assets in a company might be transferred into another company, and all the debts all the liabilities would be left within one particular company shell. Or typically you remove the bad assets into one, or the underperforming assets, the liabilities into one company, and all the juicy bits you keep in another entity, and you let one company fail to get rid of the liabilities, while the assets, the wealth still in the enterprise is captured by the shareholders. This is referred to as asset stripping. And increasingly there are laws to restrict this, but we've seen many shameless instances of this, where, for example, companies have wanted to fire employees. Legally, they're required to pay various costs to employees, compensation, effectively termination allowances, and a whole bunch of accumulated things, just cashed out payments, for example, for unused holiday leave, health insurance liabilities, a whole range of things. By moving people technically into another company that has no assets, no cash reserves, and then allowing that company to go bankrupt, some companies have shamelessly been able to fire people without paying them what they're due. And so we do see in some societies that there are very clear laws against that. In other instances, there are actually mechanisms where employers are responsible for paying into a unemployment insurance fund. So this really kind of socializes the costs of unemployment. Sometimes it's directly done, of course, through social welfare systems. Clearly, there's plenty of potential abuse here. So more and more of the law that's being written around companies, corporate law, seeks to address the director's responsibilities in the situations of bankruptcy. So when a firm is dissolved, sometimes when a profitable business is dissolved, and then the return of capital to shareholders to make sure that this kind of abuse doesn't happen. So as we can see in the slides here, I'll show you my face again, and don't necessarily want to see it. Okay, limited liability impacts on the creditors obviously when a firm can't pay its bills. Okay, so when the debts exceed the assets, the creditors bear the loss. But in which order? One of the critical things here is bankruptcy law determines the order of creditors. By definition, when a company fails, it does not have enough assets to meet all its liabilities. Well, in a very rare instance, a company may be dissolved just where its cash flow has fallen to the point where if it's continuing to trade, it's going to actually fall further and further into insolvency. Then definitely its liabilities will exceed its assets. The ideal situation, the very neat bankruptcy is the company ceases to operate just at the point where its assets meet its liabilities and it's able to dissolve, leaving no creditors unpaid. Sometimes happen, usually doesn't. Usually there's not enough money left, as we say in the kitty, not enough left behind. So who gets paid? So is it the bankers who get their loans back? Is it the suppliers to a company who've given a whole range of materials to companies, for example, on 30 or 60 or 90 days credit? So the manufacturer gets all the materials, they get the steel, they get all of these things, they get the electricity, they get the coal or whatever before they've actually paid for it. So who gets paid? Who gets their money back? So do the bondholders, for example, that have lent, who have bought corporate paper, SILS, so from the as another way of raising capital, as an investment. So the bankruptcy law decides the order of creditors, and it's quite developed in some countries, but quite remarkably, a number of countries until fairly recently haven't had proper bankruptcy laws, so it gets really messy. So it is possible for a company to be trading while it's making losses. There are many businesses like this. Uber, for most of its existence, has been trading, making losses, as long as it has a reasonable expectation of future profitability. once the managers believe that the business, if it continues to operate, can only keep losing money, and assets have sunk below liabilities, so if it continues to do business, it's just going to create more and more debt and impose more costs, then there are usually very strict rules which require that the management suspend the operations of the company and go into what we call an administration. So they declare bankruptcy proceedings, and then depending on the laws, either there's a restructuring or the business is completely dissolved. And the assets are sold off, and the distribution of what's left to the creditors based on the bankruptcy law that exists. Okay, so this is this notion of trading while insolvent. If managers knowingly continue to do business, which actually deepens the liabilities of a company that can't realistically be met, then they have seriously neglected their duties as managers, and the directors have been supposedly providing oversight to them. This is normally a very serious legal failing. Fortunately, it's also very, very common. Now, a critical notion we need to think of is the types of creditors. Now, there is a very hard-headed attitude in finance that, buyer beware, or particularly investor beware. If someone buys shares in a company or buys corporate bonds, you should know what you're doing. You should think pretty carefully about this, okay? So we have much less sympathy for the shareholder, the person who has extra cash reserves, financial reserves to be able to invest. And they choose to buy shares in a company, obviously expecting a return. And if it doesn't work out, well, that's capitalism, okay? That's rather different from the young person who goes to work for a company, maybe does baito, working for a company, and at the end of the month, just when they're about to get their pay put into the bank account, the company goes bankrupt and they don't get paid, okay? We don't expect the 16-year-old high school student to be able to realistically assess the credit worthiness of a company before they go and do their part-time job. We do expect Goldman Sachs to be able to take a realistic look at the financial prospects of a business before they take on some kind of financial exposure to an enterprise. So historically, this LTD after the name, we've talked about this earlier, of course, seen it in the context of the textbook. This is to warn people who deal with a firm of its limited liability status. If it fails, there's no one to go after for the money, okay? And typically savvy lenders to a company, creditors to a company, now whether that's providing trade finance or a bank loan, for example, these creditors voluntarily choosing to deal with a company will be looking at the potential risk and asking for effectively a higher return. They want a premium to cover the default risk, okay? And there's a whole class of financial assets out there. You can see them bundled together sometime into quite complex financial products. A guy called Michael Milken went to prison for a while, but afterwards became a philanthropist and whatnot. But he was for a while a significant market maker for junk bonds. This is the trashiest kind of companies, but the whole investment strategy that was based on effectively convincing people that, yeah, a lot of these companies are dodgy, some of them will fail, but on the other hand, they are so desperate for the money that they will pay very high interest rates. So if you have a sufficiently diversified parcel of these with the high interest rates, it's going to be still a really good investment. And sometimes this actually does work, and there's a whole kind of very sophisticated mathematics of this, which I can't do and I won't even pretend to do, okay? But if you're serious about having a career in finance, then you can very quickly find out what you should be studying on this, and there are courses to do on it, there are books to buy all about it, and whatnot. But the critical point is that savvy investors and savvy suppliers, large companies that supply product inputs to a business, have a risk assessment capability, and they will be making judgments about the premium they want. So typically, for example, if a distressed company is in danger of going bankrupt, one of its biggest problems is its suppliers will no longer supply needed materials to them on credit. So now the trade terms vary enormously in the industry. It can be from 14 days to 90 days, which means that you can pay for something 90 days after you actually get it and start using it. Construction companies tend to go into a death spiral. If the word gets out that they're in a bad way, then the suppliers of the steel, the concrete, everyone wants to get paid upfront before they will deliver anything. And so companies have a cash flow crisis. This has been the case with airlines, for example, that you need fuel for airlines and for an aeroplane. And if an airline gets a reputation actually for being in a very dire financial straits, they will have to pay cash on the spot. There are actually stories of aeroplanes having had forced landings somewhere, and the airline doesn't have a particularly good reputation, or just simply it doesn't have a existing trade credit arrangement with the particular provider of the airline fuel in the airport where it was diverted to and landed, and so they've had to pay cash on the spot for fuel so they can take off again and get back on their way. And literally they've had to go around the aircraft, and the captains have to go around the aircraft with a notebook saying, okay, who's got some cash, can we raise some money so we can get some fuel so we can get off the ground here. There are numerous stories here. So many businesses find themselves in a death spiral when people who supply critical inputs to them sense that they may be unable to pay, and therefore they want to get paid up front for everything, and it compounds the cash flow problems. But what that means is that every business that's saying that is being a voluntary creditor. When you choose to do something for someone in advance and say, pay me later, you're making an assumption that you've got a pretty, well, you're assuming you've got a pretty good measure whether this person is going to pay you or not. If someone has a really bad track record of not paying you for something, then you obviously the sensible thing to do is to not do that. So cash up front, okay? We get that. Now, that means that everyone are effectively voluntary creditors, and they're choosing to take on this certain risk of dealing because they want the business, okay? And a lot of smaller businesses are taken advantage of large businesses because they need the work, okay? They want to sell things to the big car company. One of the things that really big companies do during difficult financial times to get through short bad periods, and this happened with COVID-19 when it first hit hard in many economies, was to renegotiate payment terms. Now, that's a nice way for simply saying that companies tell their suppliers, we still want some of your stuff, but we normally pay you 30 days, within 30 days of getting it, or 28 days. We're now going to pay it for 3 months, pay you in 3 months' time, okay? So if you still want us to buy your stuff, you have to do that on new credit terms. So they arbitrarily change the payment terms. So then the company that sells them have to decide, well, am I going to do this or not? I'm not going to get any money for 3 months. I've got costs to supply materials to them. I have my own cash flow problem. And is it worth dealing with these people or not? Okay, but it's voluntary. Now, the involuntary creditor thing is a very significant thing. I think is less often thought about, but has very significant implications for the standing of the limited liability company in relation to the state, and how far the state should go in regulating what they do and holding people responsible. So, and more general issues of kind of social provision of welfare services, health services, so many other things In fact, workers' compensation schemes, for example, where people have been injured at work, very often there is a government scheme so that people get some kind of compensation in case the company that should be paying for someone for the personal injury they suffered, for example, on the factory floor, in case that company goes bankrupt and actually doesn't pay its bills. So what kind of things are we talking about with involuntary creditors? Well, I've given you some hints already. The polluter, for example, who goes bankrupt. Okay, and let me throw these slides up here to make it very clear. So these are in creditors who are not compensated for the higher default risk associated with limited liability. Okay, they are people who are often in no contractual relationship with the company whatsoever. They just so happen to be the villagers who are living down the river from the mine that has the chemical spill, for example. So they're unable to get compensation. So who do they go to? Well, they can't go to anybody. Maybe politically they can go to the government and say, terrible things have happened to us. But ultimately their case is no different from a volcano exploding and affecting their village as a big mining company coming and ruining their river and their lifestyle and indeed their only means of earning a living. Okay, so this provides a very clear rationale for governments to regulate the activities of firms which benefit from limited liability, and also to hold directors personally liable for firms' actions. And that gets kind of contentious. Limited liability benefits, though, and this is effectively why societies have accepted limited liability as the most common way to organize businesses. Although, yes, it imposes risks on creditors, they have benefited collectively and over the long term from the superior productivity of the limited liability firm. Without limited liability, firms would be more risk averse and there'll be lower levels of investment. Without that investment, you would have obviously less economic activity. You would also have lower levels of competition. This is a really important point. This hurts consumers. There'd be less innovation. There'd be less economic growth. So effectively, what's happened is that society has decided to bear the additional costs, the dangers of the socialization of the costs of companies failing, because overall limited liability companies tend to have higher growth prospects, bring more prosperity as a whole collectively to a society. And so a really important point here as a consequence of this is that the growth of both the size and the absolute number of limited liability numbers is reflected to some degree then in also the increasing role of the state in terms of various social welfare provision, precisely because there are so many social costs associated with failing limited liability companies. The state often finds itself in some sense as the insurer of last resort, intervening in a whole range of ways to attenuate, ameliorate, reduce the negative aspects of corporate capitalism, limited liability capitalism. Now, there is another psychological aspect with limited liability that we should look at, and this is separate from the practical, hard-headed calculus that people want to know their liabilities, up front from a portfolio management kind of point of view. This is more akin to the lottery effect that we can all understand. That people want to know what their downside is, and always think about this whenever you're involved in any kind of project, isn't it, any business negotiation, any personal arrangement. You say, what's the worst thing that could happen to me from this? What do I stand to lose if this goes really bad? An English expression, if this goes pear-shaped. I'm not quite sure of the origins of it, because actually pears are a nice shape. But anyway, pear-shaped is maybe it's supposed to be round, but it ends up looking like a pear. I think maybe that's what it is, which is a problem if you're trying to make a baseball. But pears themselves, I think, are very attractive. But anyway, so if this goes really bad, what's the downside risk? Okay. On the other hand, we love to dream big, don't we? So we are risk averse, but we love to dream big. So this is the classic lottery effect. Why do lottery tickets work so well for people? Well, you pay your 200 yen, you can't lose more than 200 yen, but you can imagine, you can live the dream that you might win, 1000 man yen, okay? You might win 10 million yen, okay? So you can dream of a very big upside with a very limited downside. So you want to know your exposure. Also, one of the other interesting things which has been well borne out by research done by Daniel Kahneman and his long-term collaborator Amos Tversky, unfortunately passed away. Daniel Kahneman, although a psychologist, got the Nobel Prize for Economics through a whole range of experimental endeavors, and by the way, very significantly catalyzed the development of the field of behavioral economics, which really brings psychology to economics. Kahneman and others have shown that people are much more averse to losses than they are to gains. And actually, you end up, well, you, me, we, do some of our most irrational things trying to get rid of our losses. It's been very clearly shown in repeated experiments, for example, that people start off gambling modestly, cautiously. If they're on a losing streak, if they're behind, then they will often significantly increase their bets to try and get back to at least zero. They don't like to be behind. And then, of course, that just compounds the problem. So, we know this from watching people betting on racehorses, for example. The last race of the day, people try to, throw the money down and try and get back to zero, to feel better that they're no longer on the hell side of the equation rather than the heavenly side of the equation. People want to be up; they want to finish up rather than down, or at least not behind. Okay, and so be very, very careful of that, because one of the most basic principles coming from economics, when you're being rational in economics, you ignore sunk costs, okay? You don't throw good money after bad, is an old English expression. So unlimited liability companies would terrorize people because you've got unknown downside, okay? And even if you dream big, that's offset then by the unknown downside. One of the interesting things is there's very few industries where unlimited liability companies exist as public companies. Plenty of them exist as private entities, of course, huge numbers of them. The vast majority of companies are unlimited liability, but they're private companies. They're not publicly traded. Very few instances of publicly traded unlimited liability companies tend actually to be in things like mining, but not digging holes in the ground with massive expense. They tend to be in things like exploration, where small amounts of money are being spent going to look for minerals, for example. Okay, and there are certain reasons historically why that might be a tax-efficient way to do it. Also because you've got a very clear control over what the liabilities are. If you're putting some people in some four-wheel drives with a couple of geologists and banging on rocks or whatever, and fairly low-grade capital intensiveness, you fix a certain amount and off they go. Okay, as long as they've insured the cars so they don't run over someone and kill them and have to pay $1 million to their relatives, then the chance of having very significant blowout in liabilities is very, very small. But potentially, on the other hand, if you suddenly find gold, uranium, lithium, whatever you're looking for, can be massive upside. So it kind of meets the lottery criteria effect, but that's a very limited subset of instances. Now, a couple of other things on the psychology of risk. Small investors are often attracted to holding shares in particular firms because they haven't identified with the firm or its product. This has cost me a lot of money. My conclusions is if you really like the product, just buy the product, okay? Don't necessarily go buying the shares in a company, because you can love a company, but yeah, it can be poorly run. One of the biggest disasters for me was Billabong, which I associate very much with the Gold Coast, where I spent some time when I was a kid. Good Aussie surf brand. Loved it since I was a teenager. Yeah, I think I paid about $14 for the share, and I think when they were finally forcibly bought off me, they were for a few cents a share. Okay, so buy the product, don't go buying the company unless you really know what you're doing. Another more complicated kind of thing psychologically is, and this is debated, but there's a fair degree of evidence for it in opinion polls and a range of things, and it's even used to explore political dynamics across countries. The diminishing marginal utility of wealth. As you get more money, an increase in money actually means less to you. Okay, so one of the arguments here is that loss averseness may make those with the most to invest less likely to invest at risk. What are we saying here is that if you're comfortable, and staying comfortable is fine, you know. You're not going to risk it all or a large part of your fortune just to get a bit richer than you already are, okay? Unless you've got an incredible competitive streak or a real vision or a real drive. A lot of people get comfortable with a certain level of attainment and don't want to risk it all. Of course, when television was first created in the 1950s, I figured out the basic psychology of this, that all of those quiz shows where people, do they take the money or do they challenge for more? How far do they go? What we know is that most people actually pull out at a certain point. They take the money, okay? So the Slumdog Millionaire is a classic kind of film version exploration of this. Broader argument is that societies become generally less entrepreneurial, less risk-taking as their populations become more affluent, maybe on average older. Societies become more cautious over time. So that's an ongoing open debate, but it is something we will consider. Finally, we have to turn to some critical issues of who provides governance in a context of diversification. We've talked about the logic of limited liability, how it made it attractive for investors to own small numbers of shares in lots of different companies so they could diversify, they could spread their risk across companies. So if this is the case, then who is actually going to provide the governance? Because collectively, if we've got large numbers of people all owning diverse portfolios of shares, that means you're going to have what we call highly fragmented shareholdings, where every shareholder only has a small number of shares in this particular company. You have no dominant shareholder. And so this raises some really fundamental questions about, well, for who is it rational to actually invest in monitoring what management is doing? So who are going to keep the managers who are employees of the company accountable? It makes no sense for me if I've only got 100 shares in Nissan, except for when I was teaching Nissan Corporate Case Study course, to very carefully study the financial health of Nissan, to form opinions about some of the big controversial things around the company, you know, the whole thing with Carlos Ghosn and all the rest of it, to pay attention to all of those corporate governance issues, for example. If my entire shareholding stake in it is worth the equivalent of, say, Rockman or Nanaman N, then there's just not an expected return. If, on the other hand, the French government, through having a majority stake in Renault, which has a significant shareholding in Nissan, invests effort in understanding what's going on with Nissan, that makes sense because they have skin in the game. They have a lot more to lose, especially when we think in terms of exit voice and loyalty. If you're a price taker with only a small shareholding stake, even if you express voice, it's going to be ineffectual. Okay, you're a small shareholder. The easiest thing to do is just simply sell out, to exit. If, on the other hand, you're a very large shareholder and your attempt to exit because you're a large shareholder and you're known to be a large shareholder would lead to a situation where people think, that's a large shareholder and they're getting out, maybe I should get out too. You are likely to move the market against yourself, okay? So we can see that in the context of fragmented shareholdings, the great danger is that everyone just always resorts to exit. They don't engage in voice. And before you have voice, you obviously have to have analysis. You have to have monitoring. Okay, so this is a big debate in the corporate governance literature, in the economics, and the business of, and indeed the law and the accounting literatures all talk about this. Who has sufficient incentive to invest in monitoring the firm? Okay, so when we have the separation of ownership and management of modern large enterprises with the huge capital needs of firms, this is always going to be a very significant problem. Okay, so who invests resources in monitoring the management of the modern large enterprise, and really how well monitored do managers have to be? Will managers just do the right thing out of a sense of devotion to the company? Or will they game it? Will they run it poorly to serve their own short-term interests at the expense of shareholders? Lots of issues to talk about.